Today is September 29th, 2020, and my name is Cathy Gaw. I'm a member of Ohio Psychological Association's Oral History Project, and it is my honor to introduce OPA's 2019-2020 Presidential Trio, who have agreed to share their experiences as leaders of OPA in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic and the worldwide groundswell of voices urging the United States to confront our systemic racism. Dr. Katharine Oh, if you could wave, please, so we know who you are, okay, was past president during this time and brought to OPA her experience gleaned from formal education focused on the disciplines of English, sociology, and counseling psychology, participation in the American Psychological Association's Committee of State Leaders, Search Committee for the APA CEO, Leadership Institute for Women in Psychology, and various leadership roles within Division 17, which is the Society of Counseling Psychology, and Division 35, which is the Society for the Psychology of Women, as well as her work experience as psychologist at Oberlin College's Counseling Center and director of Cleveland State University's Counseling Center. Dr. Cynthia Van Keuren was president-elect during this time and brought to OPA her experience gleaned from formal education focusing on the disciplines of psychology and business, participation in the Veterans Administration's Leadership Development Institute and the Ohio Psychological Association's Leadership Development Academy, as well as her work experience as director of the CARF accredited pain intensive outpatient program at the VA Northeast Ohio Healthcare System and staff psychologist at the Cleveland Clinic's Rehabilitation Hospital. Dr. Erich Merkle was president during this time and brought to OPA his experience gleaned from formal education focused on the disciplines of psychology, family studies, and human development, community counseling, educational administration and leadership, and school psychology. His participation as board member of the Ohio School Psychologists Association, Summit County's Family and Children First Council, and board member of the Ohio Psychological Association, as well as president of the Ohio School Psychologists Association. His work experience as adjunct instructor at Kent State University, senior lecturer at University of Akron, school psychologist and field-based intern supervisor for the Department of Child Studies for Akron Public Schools, and public adjustment consulting school psychologist for the Office of Special Education, Akron Public Schools. So welcome all three of you. And I guess I'd like to just start you out with the question of how did each of you experience the impact of the global pandemic on your leadership role within OPA?
So maybe we start with the immediate past president and work our way from sort of a Dickinson kind of Christmas past to present to future.
Sure. So one of the things I remember is that we were all in Washington, D.C., our whole contingent of OPA folks for the Practice Leadership Conference right before the COVID-19 pandemic was declared a pandemic. So there are pictures of us in DC standing close to each other without masks on when that was still something you did. We all immediately flew home and landed in a different world than we had gone to DC in. So we were coming home in March, and had to decide pretty quickly that the convention was going to be canceled. It was too quick to turn that around into an online experience for the time it was scheduled for in April. And then Erich really led a lot of the following events that occurred within OPA. So I'll let the two of you talk more about those. The piece I was probably most into was the shift to telehealth, because it wasn't really that safe to be doing in-person work anymore. By late March, we were really expected to be working from home, be conducting telehealth. So as the counseling center director at Cleveland State, I had to shift my 20 staff and trainees almost overnight to remote work and telehealth. So I was really interested in how OPA, we were able to create forums and town halls to help all of the membership make that transition. Some folks had a longer time frame than I did to shift. And so I was able to ask good questions, think about what needed to be covered as we put panels together from that experience. So that was one of the most impactful things for me, was helping with the telehealth shift and thinking about how to help our membership with that.
Thank you.
Am I next? Oh, I'm sorry. Erich, are you next?
Erich, are you next?
I guess I am.
If we're going with the spirit of Christmas?
Yes. So I would just scaffold what Catherine said. We had a really, this typical, I would say, by and large, presidential experience and leadership here in the Ohio Psychological Association, with the larger orientation to our strategic plan, and then the work we were doing with continuing our governance restructuring, with the occasional kerfuffle that happens in every year. And then all of a sudden we started hearing about this COVID, and suddenly we started hearing about folks like Dr. Van Keuren, who mentioned, who had restrictions on travel for the Practice Leadership Conference pretty quickly. And so we had gotten to Washington, D.C., and really had a fantastic experience with that whole conference. I had departed a day earlier, and I remember traveling that day back home because I had obligations to get to, and just hearing Washington, D.C. starting to progressively shut down. And I remember texting our CEO, Michael Ranney, that sounds like COVID is starting to overtake Washington, D.C., and just be careful. And then I got home, and suddenly, within a couple of days, on March 13th, the governor in the state of Ohio announced that all of our public schools would be closed thereafter. And so, much like Catherine just described, the shift to telehealth and education, we had to pivot very quickly to the world of virtual instruction. And that was on a continuum of experiences. And then at that point, our priorities in OPA very much shifted. Instead of working the strategic plan, we made a decisive group decision in our leadership to postpone the efforts there, and then really focus on what it is our membership needed, which was really organized around several areas. First and foremost, the issues of telehealth, and for a lot of practitioners who were not thinking anything about telehealth, how do we get them quickly up to speed? And then secondarily, from an advocacy and legislative standpoint, how do we support them for insurance reimbursement? Then was the idea of all the nuances of telehealth, not just counseling sessions, but teleassessment, specialized populations. And so we very quickly started deploying various assemblies and fora for our membership at no cost to our membership, really as a point of outreach. Then we started realizing at the same time that there was a whole spate of issues related to what was happening in society when it came to the social justice issues and the continuous murders of Black and brown individuals, the societal unrest. So then we started intersecting those issues as well. And then we brought forth a number of different race-centered discussions. At the same time, all of this was taking just an enormous emotional toll on practitioners in behavioral health, especially our membership. So we really started promoting the idea of self-care and wellness promotion with the guidance of our prevention and wellness program, Dr. Howard Fratkin, who just did an extraordinary job making sure all of our practitioners had access to these forums. And then there was a number of kind of intersecting discussions and assemblies that dealt with sort of the intersectionality of race versus COVID, which was a whole fruitful separate line of inquiry and professional development. And then that took us into the latter summer, into the beginning of fall. And once again, we are still here where we are. And then that allows us to kind of turn to Dr. Van Keuren and the handoff to a new presidential year, which we had already declared that we had enough crises and pandemics and other issues that Cindy's year was going to be much better because we had already accomplished all those this year. So now she was going to have a new start. And then that is where we are at as President Future, so to speak, at least in the context of this presentation.
Well, I appreciate the well wishes for a healthy year. It was interesting as you were talking about the PLC, the leadership conference, because that's one of my flashbulb memories is Cleveland Clinic offered this sort of assembly for its employees, and that's when they just kind of educated us about COVID and what to expect and PPE and guidelines. And that's when they said, you know, we're getting on an airplane, you know, the top scientists, we're getting on an airplane, we're going to Washington, D.C. today. And then tomorrow, that's when they said we're approving travel for the rest of the year. So I ended up not being able to go to PLC because it's just a few days away. And that being just a very terrifying day, just to hear that we're going to have something that will shake up our lives for the next year, is what they were saying on that day. And it still feels very surreal to me to look back on that. So I missed out on the PLC while we're kind of reeling with this new idea that we're going to really be disrupted for a while, and what that's going to mean for me as a person, me as a professional, certainly me as a member of OPA. And so the next thing that happened, I had inherited this lovely timeline of president-elect responsibilities, which just then went right out the window. None of it had relevance anymore. Everything was different. We were just trying to figure things out really day by day and trying to make some pretty big decisions to meet the needs of our memberships. Obviously, people were anxious, they're posting things, they're asking questions, and we would just look for kind of themes for those questions and decide that we're going to do a town hall about this one, or we're going to ask this particular person to respond to them on behalf of OPA and get these people involved. So it was just such a high adrenaline, sleepless sort of time for a while, just trying to find our footing. And the level of devotion to this organization and to the profession of psychology is moving. It's very moving. We have so many amazing people who just volunteer their time with little to sometimes no notice to help better our profession and make sure that our communities and our patient population was cared for. So it was just a really, again, even just looking back on that particular day when you mentioned PLC and just what an experience that was. And I remember texting a friend saying, this is real. This is really going to happen. And we need to get ready. And then within a week, the world was different.
And thinking about that pivot, and I'm going to ask about the pandemic first. What do you think the lasting changes have been to the practice of psychology as a result?
So I think in a couple broad strokes, there's not just changes to psychology, but I think changes to society. And the idea that things like telework are possible, even if one didn't believe that it was. The idea that you can actually do telemeetings and be teleproductive, if that's even a term, working from a shelter-in-place environment. And then I think it forced some issues of telepsychology and telebehavioral health practice that maybe insurance providers and legislator actors were not necessarily ready to contemplate yet, but it showed that it was possible. And then I think it also taught us not just about the incredible capacity of a state association and its professional staff in particular to be responsive and to go above and beyond, but just the overall caring and compassion that we have as a community of psychologists to be able to support each of our members and the larger practice of psychology. And even today, I remain incredibly humbled by both our professional staff of our association, but just our broader community, and how many countless people volunteered their time and their varied expertise to contribute, whether it was geropsychology or insurance, or it was the technology aspects, or child and adolescent psychology, or our whole immense group of colleagues from the VA who already were at the forefront of telepsychology. So I think there is a lot of different areas of practice, and I have had this conversation with so many others, none of whom would probably think of themselves as futurists, but we do wonder, did this now establish a baseline for what life may look like moving forward? Because we saw we could do this, and this being lots of areas of professional work, what does that mean moving forward?
Agreed. And if I can say, as someone who has been a proponent of telemedicine work for years, I feel very vindicated. I've had so many conversations over the years with folks, with professionals who just aren't comfortable with it for various reasons, and really concerned about different ethical questions and platforms and security. And here it was just kind of thrown in everybody's laps, and they just said, we're gonna figure it out. We're gonna just do it and hope for the best and be respectful of our patients and our profession, and it went pretty well. So I do think that's going to continue. I think it's more convenient for a lot of folks on both sides of the desk in terms of people not having to worry about gas money or childcare, or and professionals being able to have more flexible shifts if they're working from home. So I think that is something that's going to continue. Another change that I think will continue is I think because so much of the work was being done from home, I think we became a little bit more human to our patients and to our clients. When you're doing a therapy and the dog barks or the cat walks across the screen or the partner walks through the room, I think people just became more curious about us as people. I work in an inpatient setting, so I didn't work from home, but I still felt the shift there because people were worried that I'm going home. I'm wearing a mask all day. I'm in this this particular setting, and are you going to be okay? And what are you doing for groceries? And it was just really such a unique experience to connect with the patients, to just kind of be appreciated in that way, and for me to not have that sort of defensive reaction and process why they're asking. Just answer the question, just be real, just kind of have that experience with people who are really reaching out of concern. So I think that's something that's going to continue as well, is that the intimacy of the relationships will be a little bit different going forward.
Yeah, a couple of the pieces that I noticed were similar to what you just said, Cindy, around folks wondering about the mental health care providers' mental health. When I read about it in the newspaper and they're talking about therapy, they point out that the therapists are going through the exact same societal upheaval and traumas and difficulties that they're helping people with. So it's not like regular trauma work or helping someone through an upheaval in their own life. When we're in a different place and we're stable and healthy, they know we're going through the same things they are. And so there's a little more, I think, curiosity about how do we manage our own struggles and difficulties and challenges. I think because so many people have been impacted in terms of their mental health and well-being by the pandemic, I'm hoping that mental health has a little less stigma around it now, and that might be one of the changes for us, that It's more common for people to talk about going to their therapist or encouraging each other to go to therapy, because we've all lived through something that we all need therapy for, and that's not anything to be ashamed about. So I'm hoping that is becoming a bit more normalized. I think another piece for me, I haven't seen it change all the way yet to make sure it's going to be lasting, but I've noticed that we all suddenly know what it's like to live in a world where we can't just go about and do whatever we want when we want to without planning. I have friends with disabilities or chronic illnesses where that has been their reality for years. And the rest of us have sort of taken our freedom for granted quite a bit. So I'm interested to see if there's going to be more accessibility or awareness of chronic illness and disability in our field or in our world. But that's a shift I would love to see really click in to be a little bit more lasting. You know, even being able to work from home, where before it may not have been considered a reasonable accommodation. I think we all know now, most of us can work from home. It's a reasonable accommodation. So I'm hoping there will be more accessibility in the world after this.
I think, you know, scaffolding on that, we also have come to appreciate this technology fatigue, you know, the idea of Zoom fatigue, although we won't just malign Zoom, it could be Microsoft Teams or Citrix or what have you. The idea that we spend staring into the abyss of a camera for 6, 8, 10 hours a day, all the way to incidental things. Like Cindy, I remember in one of the forums, you talked about the importance of making sure that your background and your clothing matches, so that you didn't wash out into a telesession, which, you know, even today I remember. Now I made sure I wore dark tonight so I didn't wash out, blend into my curtains or something. And, you know, these are all things that none of us probably would have given much emotional energy or language to, you know, 12 months ago.
And I think, have you noticed any impact on ideas of isolation and connection as a result of this, and how that affects OPA and practice? I mean, it seems like, I know one way it seems like it affected OPA is that a lot more people joined.
And I think we were able to demonstrate that this was a nimble association that was able to embrace what the needs of our membership was. And, you know, sometimes I think we just, out of indoctrination and inculcation into the professional role, we know we should be a part of our professional associations, or it's a registrar of our MCEs, or a provider of professional development or advocacy services. But now we suddenly had a position where we were providing something tangible that met the immediacy need of our members. And there's not a lot of times that you can do that. You know, it's not to say that our professional development doesn't meet needs, and of course I wouldn't want to argue that, but the idea that when you needed to know about CPT codes, or you needed to know how do you just get your technology up and running so that you can still earn a livelihood, these are real, you know, almost like in a Maslow kind of sense, like how do you just hit the base subsistence needs of the practice of your craft? And that was really, I think, incredibly neat to see that. And our membership responded, and they valued us. And despite all of the insults we had to things like losing our convention, we still had a financially solvent year, which I think this speaks to the fact that this association was able to meet its members where it was at, and to provide those services in a way that allowed us to continue to be solvent too, which is just a side benefit.
At the telehealth forum that I went to, it was really one of those first few weeks of the pandemic when people did not have their feet under them, did not even know quite where to start when thinking about all the changes they needed to make to their practice. And being together in a room, I think there were 50 people at that online forum. Folks were quite moved to hear psychologists who've been doing telehealth for a while. They were moved to hear other people ask the same questions they had. It felt very much like a community and that we were not alone in the challenges we were facing. So I think being able to provide those spaces for psychologists to come together just had so much value at that moment. So I do think people really understood the value of OPA and that as a community to connect with each other and get good advice and be together in that challenge.
And I think that's an area where Howard Fradkin really was able to shine, because he sort of paired up with so many of these things while we're trying to target some of the logistics of telehealth and insurance reimbursement and office space, that he was right there to kind of hold us together emotionally and give people a chance to talk about how scary this is and their own feelings about what might be happening, and just get that chance to feel normal. I think that was a real gift for this past year.
And I think that the pandemic was a very laid a very important foundation for then the global response to George Floyd's killing. And because people, I think, were already becoming aware of and experiencing less freedom, as Katharine mentioned, also truly seeing and experiencing the health disparities and other disparities in terms of who has to go into the workplace and who doesn't have to, and that kind of thing. And so I'm really curious in how you all viewed the impact of that uprising and the continued energy around that on your leadership roles at that time.
And I think all of us have tremendous sensitivity about the disparate impact of COVID on Black and Indigenous people of color, whether it's access to healthcare or the existence of risk factors that meant that our Black and Brown communities were being so much more impacted by COVID. And so if there was ever a pandemic or condition that could really punctuate white privilege sometimes, this was that moment. And then it allowed us to have some intentional conversations, because now we had the interweaving of multiple remarkable events in society. We had a pandemic that most of us had not seen since the Spanish flu of 1918, and most of us were not around for that. Then we've seen the tremendous social unrest because of Black and Brown individuals being murdered at the hands of law enforcement, and appreciation of terms like white privilege, implicit bias, structural racism that were really entering into the national zeitgeist of a conversation that also did not always occur in the last couple of years. And then we saw also the impact of an economic downturn. And then weaving throughout all of that was this thread of the politics as well. And politicians who were either helpful or adding more hubris and rhetoric that just either served to inflame and potentiate all of the strife, or other politicians who tried to seek calm and conciliation. And so I think that was always a backdrop of everything we do. And, you know, as we look on this recording right now, we have 3 people who are all white, higher SES individuals. And yet at the same time, we are trying to promote the social justice mores of our profession, of our association, and do that in a way that both supported those initiatives while being still conscientious to all of the immediacy needs of our membership. And, you know, I don't know if we were effective in trying to serve all of those different points simultaneously. But I think there was probably a few times that I can ever think of professionally where we just saw the intersectionality of so many different challenges all at once.
And I do think that there was this sort of unifying sense that we have to do something. And I think, of course, what it is that we should do is still being tossed around while we're taking some steps. But there was just that collective, this must stop. And it coincidentally, we had a diversity town hall that was scheduled for the day after George Floyd's death. And so it just became an opportunity to have real conversations about how we were all trying to make sense of this news and what we were moved to do and what limits we were going to set with people who perhaps were promoting racist ideas. And so it just really became this sort of shared accountability and this sense of it's time to take some action. And I think that we have, and we will continue to. But I also think it brought up some really important conversations about OPA's mission. Are we social justice? Are we a professional organization? Are we advocacy? And kind of trying to figure out how do we have all of those things and be all of those things to our members. And I think that's a conversation we're going to continue to have.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges we've had is that we don't have a big critical mass of people of color in our membership and in our leadership. And so it's hard to draw a lot more people of color in when they don't see people of color in the top leadership positions. Now that's, changing every few years. We do have more folks of color coming up as president, and certainly our Leadership Development Academy is really engaging more diverse leaders for OPA. But it felt like, we kept leaning on the same people to lead and help, even while they were probably the ones most impacted by the events. So I think we always walk that tightrope of wanting to support and not burden folks. So I experienced the protests and movement this summer in some ways as an awakening for our whole society. A lot of the people I spoke to who have been watching racial injustice in the news for years said, this is nothing new.
Mm-hmm.
What's new is there was a video, everyone got upset about it. People weren't going to work, so they had time to protest, So I think for a lot of folks, it was more in some ways of a white awakening to racial injustice and systemic racism. And so we were able to provide some resources. Mary Miller was fantastic about creating a big webpage on the OPA website with resources to help people cope and putting things out on the listserv for folks. But it feels like a piece where, we've been working for years to integrate more diversity into our actions, our leadership, and it's a slow process. So when George Floyd was killed this summer, it felt like the one or two items in our strategic plan related to diversity seemed too small and not urgent enough. Our plan was to incorporate diversity in all of our action items, but it didn't feel like much when I looked back at it. So I think that's a continued struggle for OPA and a growth edge, and we're getting there, but it I think may take a generation or another decade to feel like we have a full, good critical mass of people of color in OPA leadership and membership.
And, I think something else as president, because at some point the communication buck stops somewhere. And I guess one of the things I learned as president, that I guess it stops at the president. One of the things I learned too was the idea that psychology is often perceived as this liberal profession and that the practitioners are liberal. But we had heard from a number of members, because of either OPA listserv discussions or other events, that a lot of times we weren't embracing the diversity of political thought and social justice thought too. And although there are many of us who would skew to the progressive or left side, we were doing that to the detriment of moderate or conservative members. And that is a whole separate discussion that I think that weaves into Cindy's point of You know, are we a guild, a trade association, or are we actually a social justice organization? And, you know, are we both? But then how do we do that in a way that complements and supports these wide-ranging perspectives? Because our profession is simply just not all liberals and progressives. And I think sometimes we forget that. And as we talk about the overarching themes of our social justice work and the societal unrest and the racial unrest, we also can't ignore the political realities there. And some of the reforms that are necessary to happen to support the racial injustice and structural racism also then get into very complex political discussions too. And not our entire profession is unified about those solutions. And being very sensitive that just because there is a liberal or progressive orientation here doesn't mean that that's the entire orientation of all of our membership or our practitioners or the field of psychology.
And I know that OPA has, in the last year and a half or so, just begun to finally reach out to rural practitioners and their clientele. And I know that that was something that, you know, Peg Mosier and I have been talking about for years. And that clearly is an area, at least in Ohio, that is not leaning towards the liberal, and that I think it's a very good time for all of those conversations to be coming up.
Yeah, I think this, sometimes when people are reacting to these extreme events that we've seen, I think the rhetoric can become really polarized, and it's easy to be dismissive of people with different views. So I think that's one of the pieces around our communication, is to always try to uphold that respect and regard for people who have very different worldviews or assumptions about the issues we're talking about, so that we're modeling that understanding and dialogue and care for each other.
So that's a nice lead into my wondering, what are your hopes? How would you like to see OPA forge ahead with lessons learned or issues identified in 2020?
Well, my largest hope would be that learning how to be responsive to our membership, regardless if you're a practitioner or you're an academic or what your specialty is, or your race or political affiliation or any other aspect, that we learn that we want to make sure that we are embracing the totality of our membership and needs. And we saw that if we build it, they will come, and to continue to do that. And we showed that we can do this virtually, we can do it in person, we can do it through listserv communications, we can do it through blog communications and social media communications. And I think the one takeaway for me is that if we continue to respond to our membership, not just in the big picture of our strategic plan, but also in the here and now, we show value as an association, as an SPTA, as an affiliate of APA. I think that is one of the most important parts to me, is that we are continuously responsive to what our members need, and being willing, even if not courageous or building the plane and flying it in some cases, as it felt like in the last number of months, to do that, whatever that is at that moment.
I agree, and I very much hoped that continues to reflect the current, not only the needs and interests, but the availability of our membership. I'm not sure that monthly meetings are going to be the go-to way to participate anymore. I just don't know that that's what people have available to them, but they still care and they're passionate about what they do. And I think that we're going to see our volunteer base shift a little bit. Maybe fewer meetings, but more hands-on, call me when you need this, I want to be involved in this kind of projects. And we'll see how that goes. But while people are shifting their priorities in 2020, which has caused us all to rethink them, I think that just volunteering is going to look different going forward, and I want to support that in whatever people want to do. We're happy to have you.
Yeah, I think one of the pieces that's that we've seen is that we can adapt really quickly. In the past, I think we got better at putting out responses to events or making statements, and we got good at doing those fairly quickly so that people felt like we care about what just happened, some tragedy that just occurred. But this mobilization that Erich led this spring was unprecedented, and not only the leadership and members responded, but the staff was incredibly hardworking, adjusted quickly. They were amazing in organizing and facilitating all of these things that were scheduled off the cuff. Jim Broyles, I was reviewing our strategic plan, and one of the items was to have more consultations around practice with Jim Broyles. I think we can cut that off the list. So everyone was calling Jim Broyles. How do I get reimbursed for telehealth? What do I do? And he would just sort of respond to everyone, collect the questions, and then create a town hall out of it to try to get 50 at one time instead of doing those calls one by one. So everyone just threw themselves into it and adapted so quickly. And the staff and the convention committee, even though we had to cancel the convention, they worked hard to have a number of those programs become webinars so that we still made quite a bit of money. And, so they were able to make it work fiscally and also just in terms of helping us provide everything we wanted to do for the membership. So I think now we know how adaptive we are. I'm hoping that means, that we'll learn we can adapt quickly, even if it's not a global crisis, but just a societal need. Now we know we can be responsive to these societal needs. I hope that will be something that lasts for us as an association.
And I think, Katharine, your work with the governance changes in our association helped to serve as a springboard for that. I can't imagine, to a certain degree, if we had a board of 55 some people, what that would have been like. I had said multiple times that it felt like many times Michael and Cindy and I were in this very dysfunctional marriage, and I still question their choice of partners in that marriage. But we would spend so much time in these emails and text messages and phone calls just trying to figure out which way to go with different things. And it truly became its own full-time job. But in doing so, it also showed that we did not have to be a bunch of doctor level people admiring problems or an analysis of paralysis or paralysis of analysis situation. And we could quickly pivot to things. And I think that's a testament of our governance model changes in the association. And I think it's a demonstrative aspect that we can change and be responsive and do more than just admire problems or, philosophically or academically debate things. We can actually put an action plan in place and make it happen.
And I think that we're seeing that carry over already. So we had a priority 2 meeting today. We had a priority 1 meeting recently, and seeing how people are kind of now taking this sort of ownership for OPA. It's not that they're part of a committee, but they can see how this fits with these other committees and who they're responsible to and who they can share resources with. And I'm seeing that play out in these last couple of meetings where now they're like, oh, okay, I see this now, I get it. And overlapping with ideas. And I think it's just been really rewarding to kind of watch this progress over the last 3 years. And I think that the process that you put in place, Katharine, is really going to, I think by next year, I think we're just going to really be all the more amazing.
Absolutely. And then we're also seeing the collaborative aspects, whether with other behavioral health organizations. And just recently, we have seen a number of tiers of just collaborating with us, but the Ohio School Psych Association on the disaster and crisis teams and the journals even to some aspects of membership outreach, which especially Kathy, I'm sure you can think back to your more formative days in OPA. The idea that OSPA and OPA were collaborating on anything might be a bit heretical. And, you know, now it's a part that both associations realize this is for the greater good of our constituents, our state, and Ohio psychology, regardless of what your specialty area of practice is.
I also think that OPA has gotten better at figuring out how to create a strategic plan that has meaning, and then being able to do it, because we've had, in my involvement with OPA, probably 3-4 different strategic plans, but this is the first one that feels like it was created around things not just that OPA was committed to doing, but things that members were really concerned about: the opioid crisis, health disparities, and now it's, you know, raising the racial social justice and all those disparities as well. So it's just fascinating to see how all of these parts keep coming together and fine-tuning more and more and more.
And, you know, the irony of having to suspend a strategic plan in order to focus on immediate needs, we actually fulfilled a lot of the strategic plan in the work that we did, which was probably just a brilliant leadership at the time, of course. But you know, the fact that we actually were able to hit a number of those different strategic priorities really is rather remarkable. And we did that by happenstance and accident, honestly. And it just goes to show that when there is still that overarching framework out there somewhere, and it's, even though we had to suspend, it still was in the back of our minds that, you know, we were focusing on opioids, promoting psychology, and intersystem collaboration and aligning with various systems. We did that, even though we maybe didn't do that in priority meetings and what else, we had to do it in real time.
Yeah, a couple of those items were, you know, working on legislative goals with SIPACT and the RX bill, and SIPACT became very relevant all of a sudden. Serendipitously, trying to raise the profile of psychology and help the public understand the importance of psychology. I feel like during the pandemic, we looked pretty good. Psychologists really adapted quickly, and we were there for our clients. So I think the whole membership participated in that and made that happen and helped accomplish those visions that we were developing through the plan.
And in doing so, we also showed that a state association like OPA can even have national relevance, because APA has recognized the work of this association, its leaders, its staff, and all of its responsiveness. And again, it really did take that proverbial village to make this happen.
Yeah.
But, it really was remarkable just what OPA has done. And, I think if the Looney Tunes piano fell on each of us, we could still have peace knowing that we were able to do some impactful things that supported our constituents, supported psychology, supported all of our members, and was for the greater good. Not that I'm asking for Looney Tune pianos, because these are biblical plagues, and who knows where.
That's all that's missing from the year, isn't it?
Exactly. You know, the falling pianos and Wile E. Coyote could be happening next month. So
The Acme Anvil. Well, and I have to say that I think psychologists in Ohio and members of OPA owe the three of you a huge debt of gratitude for your openness, your flexibility, your good humor, your willingness to work with an outstanding staff. I think, you know, if not for the three of you and the outstanding staff, you know, we see what's happening in other areas of our world where there is lack of leadership, and your leadership definitely helped provide the structure that we needed so we could jump out into all of those areas. And
which is gracious of you to say, Kathy, but as one of our vice presidents, all of us were just part of that team. It was our vice presidents, our APA delegate, it was our staff, and it was all of our committee chairs, all kind of coalescing together here to do this work. So, you know, I mean, I guess I get the honor of being one of the three figureheads, but it really was all of us as a leadership team. And it was a professional psychology ultimately that came together as a community. And, you know, as Churchill reminds us, you know, don't waste the opportunity of a good crisis. And, you know, we certainly did in this case, not hopefully waste that opportunity to be relevant and support all of our different constituents.
Well, thank you all very much for participating in this interview. I know that now that your past terms are behind you, you're probably wanting to move into a more normalized life, except Cindy, who's stuck being president now.
And that whole experience is completely abnormal by any stretch. So.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kathy, for having us. And,
Yes.
and really on behalf of all of us, we thank you for this opportunity to share a little bit of this. But also I celebrate, you know, looking across the four of us, I mean, just our friendship and our collegiality too.